The audio content presented here dates back to the inception of my podcasting journey, spanning up to over a decade ago. Please note that the views expressed in this content reflect an earlier version of myself. As my perspectives have evolved over time, so have I. Listeners are encouraged to approach this material with awareness of its historical context. And now, on to what you've been waiting to hear.
Kevin Christensen, welcome to the podcast. How are you today?
I'm very good. Thank you, Bill.
Good. Glad to have you on. In today's episode, what we want to discuss at length is the idea behind what expectations and assumptions we make about what a prophet, or for that matter, what an apostle needs to fill. And we often draw ideas that perhaps aren't rooted in truth within the scriptures. And so, Kevin, I'll let you kind of share a brief bio about yourself, but Kevin has done some lengthy work on some articles that have been published that deal with this whole idea. So, Kevin, maybe if we can just start off with you just sharing a little bit about who you are so that my listeners get a feel for some of the work that you've done.
Okay, well, I'm a technical writer. I've been a technical writer for 30 years. It took a while to get into that. I didn't start till I was 30, but I've been doing that for 30 years. I've been a member all my life. I grew up in Utah. I went on a mission to England. And while I was in England, I went to we were sharing a little film called Meet the Mormons at a town called Colne. And we could see these little middle schoolers passing around their first anti-Mormon pamphlets, with this just excitement. I just thought, this is going to go well. But I found that some of these kids were asking me questions that I didn't have really good answers for. And then I found that kind of annoying. And but at the time I was reading the scriptures a lot myself and finding out I was learning things that I hadn't been taught, and that was helpful. So then there's another period out there where I was teaching an investigator who was reading the Book of Mormon. He just decided to do it his own way and read Mosiah's Discourse, and he came to us and said, I don't buy it. Well, what's wrong? He said, well, it says that at the end of this discourse that everyone was converted. And he said, people aren't like that. Somebody would have disbelieved just because of his view of human nature. And at the time, the best answer I could give was, well, it was a good speech, which wasn't very good. But about a year after that, when I was working out of Lancaster area, I had some investigators up in Kendall loan me a book called An Approach to the Book of Mormon by Hugh Nibley, which was the first Nibley I'd consciously read. And I took it to our apartment on our P-Day, and I thought I'd just read the interesting chapters while I was in the bathtub. And I read the whole book. My companion, Elder Lawrence, was writing letters all day. I just got through the entire thing, and that changed me. So when I got back, I had this, I had open questions. Why was it that things that seemed so obvious to me were so hard for other people to believe? And so I started tracking scriptures in the Bible. I thought, well, so what are the keys for true and false prophets? And I started collecting these and collecting ones that, as I started collecting, I noticed that there were several things that didn't usually come up when the question came up. So over the years, I collected lots of these. And at one point, my study has about 28, and they're all neatly paired with keys for false prophets. So that helps you apply them properly. And what I found personally is that just made things more obvious to me than they'd been before. So then I started studying passages in the Bible that said, okay, what should you do to find truth? And I came up with these, and that was also very helpful. And it turned out that, it's not be a narrow-minded fundamentalist who only defers to authority all the time. It's about making serious inquiries about everything. And that was very helpful, but it still didn't answer my question. Why is it that these things that seem so obvious to me and, with my testimony, don't seem obvious to other people? So then I started studying biblical passages where somebody's justifying their rejection of a Bible prophet. And that's where it sort of came together. After I came up with about 70 of these, I realized that none of them had gone out of date. And that brought the scriptures to life for me in ways that other kinds of questions I'd been asking didn't, because people were talking the same way that they had been doing 2,000 years ago. And the picture that I got from this, I was talking about it with an ex-sister-in-law, and she recommended that I read a book by Thomas Kuhn called The Structure of Scientific Revolutions. So I read that, and a lot of my work since then has relied on Thomas Kuhn. But I'd kind of figured a lot of the same picture just by reading the scriptures. which I think is interesting. And then I later made connections with Alma 32, which I think gives the same epistemology as Thomas Kuhn. So it's all very advanced and interesting. And I did have one brief crisis of faith for about 3 days in the early 1990s. Got an issue of Dialogue with an article on the creation accounts by Anthony Hutchinson. And that bothered me for a couple of days. I was looking at one of the pages in that article, and it had a diagram of what he called the Hebrew cosmos. And it has, the firmament up above, this rigid firmament, and there's waters above that, and then there's windows in heaven, and there's the pillars of, or corners of the earth, and then the waters beneath, and this flat earth, all described. And I was looking at that diagram and pondering it, and I thought, where have I seen this before? Because I'd gotten involved in Hugh Nibley and had been tracking down all things Nibley. This is back in the day where there wasn't that much available. I'd come home and I'd bought Sense Cumorah and Mythmakers and Lehi in the Desert and The World and the Prophets, and I'd been tracking down unpublished things in various places. And around the time I exhausted all those possibilities, farms started up. And so I started collecting the stuff that they were publishing, these preliminary reports. And one of those was a 1980 paper called Three Facsimiles of the Book of Abraham. And that one quoted from a book called Hamlet's Mill by Erth van Dekond and de Santillana. And there's a passage in that talks about archaic cosmology. And the archaic cosmology in there turned out to match very well with our Book of Abraham, and it's based on the idea of the precession of the equinoxes that takes place every 26,000 years. And because there's one star that is, because it's at right angles to the plane of the ecliptic, it doesn't wobble with the rest of the precession, which is basically the Earth wobbles. So from the point of view of an observer on the Earth, the whole cosmos wobbles. There's one star that doesn't, so it looks like everything is rotating around that. And the Arabic name for that star is Kaleb. So I wrote an article for Dialogue, and it had been, a long time passed before I heard back. In fact, I'd even forgotten I'd written the essay, but they published it in 1991. And then later I started writing things for farms, and they were all published. And so a few years ago, then also got into a debate with a guy named Richard Baines, who annoyed me enough when he was claiming that he could reject Joseph Smith based on, what he called the biblical test for a prophet, that I decided I'd better get my stuff published. So I hauled out what I could find of my old notes, my old typewritten notes, and put together a hypertext version of the document, and did that for FAIR. And the hypertext is important because, I hadn't published it before because it's just lots and lots and lots and lots of quotes, and who's going to want to read that stuff? But in a hypertext format, I can put the information down at a lower level, and people can just browse through and figure out, where they want more detail, but get an overview of what's going on.
Pretty cool. Yeah, I appreciate that. And I guess the follow-up question then, it sounds like, I wanted to ask you how you got involved in apologetics, but it sounds like in a formal manner that you essentially just started writing things down as questions came up or as criticisms came up that you felt like you had a perspective on, you simply wrote something and sent it in, huh?
Yeah, well, it was the Dialogue article. Yeah, I just realized that I had something to say. I was just interested. When I got back from my mission, I just got more interested and started reading. And, Nibley led to Richard L. Anderson and to Dialogue and BYU Studies and Sunstones. And if we were videoing this, I could show you I've got stacks and stacks of books and bookshelves here that I've accumulated over the years. And it just got to the point where, with that Dialogue essay, I realized I had something to say, and it was published. And then a little while later, I was reading a book by Raymond Moody called The Light Beyond about near-death experiences, and I realized that I had something to say about that because I saw Alma's conversion as a near-death experience. And then in 1985, when the Roberts study was published, I read that from the library, and then a little bit later, Vogel wrote his book. And I thought, well, I'll read that because I'd like to see, what further research on the topic was. And I read Vogel's Indian Origins in the Book of Mormon, and I realized I had something to say about that. And I sent that stuff all off, and it was all published. I didn't know it was difficult. I just ended up doing it.
Gotcha. As I say, it would be, I think, valuable that you say that, because there's going to be people who listen to this episode either through the Fair blog or my site, and as they're listening to this interview, they may be thinking that they've got some perspective on things that they'd like to share, but they feel like in order to get something published, you have to be either well known or in some professional capacity. But in reality, if one has a perspective that works, that is viable, then they ought to try and put something together, right?
Yeah. Hugh Nibley wrote a paper, and he said on publication in graduate school, and he said to get published, you need something that is original, authentic, and significant. And if it has those three characteristics, you'll have no trouble getting published. And if it lacks those, it shouldn't be.
Gotcha. Yeah, that's great. And the other question I want to ask you before we start jumping into the questions I've got regarding prophets and what test we should have rather than the ones we think we should have, I want to ask you, because you mentioned this brief faith crisis that you had, I wanted to ask you just over the years, because I don't know how many people that listen to this are going to know you, but you seem to be a very calm and collective guy, one who doesn't get outwardly or frustrated in a way that is apparent to people. You seem to be very cool and calm in the way that you handle your responses. And I know that you've obviously gone through paradigm shifts in your growth as a church member, and as you've figured out things that don't work and things that do work. Just listening to you talk about some of these papers you've written shows that. How have you handled these paradigm shifts? When you wake up one day and you read something, you go, uh-oh, what I used to believe no longer works. What's your process for working through that?
Well, in retrospect, what I've done is when I run across something that I didn't expect, I ask myself, oh, that's interesting. What should I expect? And I give things time, and I keep my eyes open. The alternative to that, and that sounds simple, but the alternative is to never change my assumptions, to insist on answers now, and what did I say? Give things time, keep my eyes open. That means I'm constantly trying to learn, keep up, and just give things time instead of insisting on answers right now. So, the thing with, even with the Hutchinson article, I realized that I wasn't prepared for some of the stuff that he was saying, but I gave myself time, and I also figured out that if I kept my eyes open, I'd learn stuff and change my perspective. And so it's the difference between disillusion and enlightenment is whether the experience is of shattering or growth. And if I just give myself room to grow, I save myself a lot of pain.
That's beautiful. And I guess maybe just the only point I would make is for those listening, there's if we want to split things up into a dichotomy, there's the way I handle things, which is to get angry and bitter and to throw things against the wall and to shout and scream until somebody acknowledges the frustration I have. Or you can handle things Kevin's way, which is to give things time and to process things and to look for answers and to not demand an answer at the immediate moment. So I hope people can see the value in your method over the one that I tend to use. And anyway, I just think that's important. I think that we always talk about this shelf and putting things on the shelf for a while, and some people can't do that. They feel like they can anyway, and as they encounter things that are problematic, they feel this need for an immediate answer. But in reality, the amount of information that one needs to take in, consider, ponder, match against other things, reevaluate one's own expectations and assumptions that one makes, that takes time, doesn't it?
Yeah, it does. But here's another story that I tell, and this is one I told in my first dialogue article. It says, when I was a kid, when I was a little boy, this is one of almost my earliest memories. My dad drove us down to the Cleveland Lloyd Dinosaur Quarry in central Utah. And this is when, unimproved roads, you couldn't tell that it was a road, just a dirt track, really rough. And my memories are of dust and things banging on the bottom of the car. And we get out there, and at this point, there was no kind of museum or anything. It's just the place where there's a few paleontologists and students, and they're exposing bones in the rocks. So, what am I, 3 or 4 years old, but I could look at those bones in the rocks and I knew the bones were real. And I've learned a great deal since then about dinosaur bones, and a lot of it's changed since then, radically. They've gone from being cold-blooded to warm-blooded. The Brontosaurus, with its cool name of thunder lizard, no longer exists because it turns out that in the race to get a complete skeleton, a fossil hunter had stuck the wrong head on. So now it's the apatosaurus, and they travel in herds, and instead of living in swamps like you see in, the old King Kong, they traveled in herds with their tails raised, and they, with teeth designed to strip needles from pine trees and stuff. So you get all of these things that change about it, but the thing that doesn't change is that the bones are real, and a child could tell that.
Right.
And so the experiences that I've had in the church that my testimony is based on are more the wine than the wineskin. It's not the surface that holds things together, which is expendable, but the stuff that those surfaces are designed to contain.
You say the brontosaurus, from what we know now, doesn't exist. That crashes my world because that was my favorite dinosaur.
It was for a lot of people, yeah. Over that started out, showing this brontosaurus skeleton in a museum, and then a chainsaw comes on and they cut the head off because, to illustrate that, that somebody had made a mistake.
Right. And it's something that we all had for years, and we, it was either Triceratops, Tyrannosaurus Rex, or Brontosaurus. Well, that's amazing. So we learn something every day. I want to pose, I guess, the issue from the perspective of one in crisis and what they perceive, and then we can start to kind of dive in. All right. So the problem that I think people in crisis perceive, and having been there, I hope that I word this right. Members of the church grow up with the feeling of, because of what they're taught by other members, by the things they put together from talks in church magazines, church manuals, and even conference talks, members of the church get this impression of a prophet. And what that impression is a prophet is somebody who is almost perfect. We kind of teach in the church that the idea that the spokesman of the Lord, the prophet of the church, is this person who is very close to perfection and has very little of flaws or of personal weakness. The other thing we run into is we expect, because we've been taught, that our prophet is just like Moses and Abraham and Noah, and we use that exact wordage in our manuals and the way we talk about them. We come to expect these mighty miracles that are publicized throughout the land of these men. We expect these great and marvelous things from these men. And when we first either join the church or growing up in the church, we kind of adopt that as kind of our black and white view. And someday we encounter information, perspectives, experiences, which lead us to understand that those assumptions and expectations aren't correct. And many members, when they encounter this, feel like the assumption and the expectation is absolutely realistic, and it's simply the church prophets that have fallen short. And at that point, they lose faith. And so what I want to do is I want to run us through some of the ideas that you've come across scripturally and how you've expanded on those, and give you a chance to take our listeners, take their perspective, and put it back into a way that they now have new assumptions and expectations that are actually biblically held as true, and their expectations and assumptions that our church leaders can then flourish in and absolutely be seen as a prophet or as prophets and apostles. Is that fair? All right, so Kevin, with that said, kind of setting up the background, I know the first thing that you kind of wrote about in putting your paper together on this idea is to help people first grasp what they need to be able to do to see truth. And I wondered if you could run us through some of the things that you think us as members of the church need to be able to do so that when truth comes along, we'll recognize it.
You can find scriptures on this, what you're to do to see truth, and basically they come to say, well, you've got to be interested. Of course, if you're not interested, every missionary knows what happens.
Right.
You have to listen with purposeful intent, seeking knowledge of God, not just to satisfy some curiosity. It's got to be meaningful. You have to have open minds and have faith, where you're hoping for that which you don't see. You examine what the prophet brings forward. And in Joseph Smith's case, you've got the Book of Mormon and the whole life, and there's stuff for the Bible. You listen to the witnesses, and you don't just select to find somebody who's going to tell you what you want to hear. Consider the credentials and motives of the authorities and witnesses involved. And you should be as concerned with measuring yourself as measuring the prophets. That's the mote eye business. If we've got beams in our own eye, how can we know that we're seeing clearly? And so there has to be some self-reflection, and pray, and then persist whatever the cost. And it turns out that I think there's an organic relationship between the things that you're supposed to do to see truth and what happens when you don't. The arguments against Bible prophets are always related to some failure at one of these points. And so what is it that we're supposed to be looking for in a prophet? And you talk about expectations. And sometimes culturally, you're right, they do set it up. They do sometimes set us up for a fall. I don't think they mean to. I think it's just there's certain personalities at a certain level of development just like to have that authority to be there to have everything right. And so it used to be when they published the conference issue of the Ensign, they used to publish on the back from D&C 1, whether by mine own voice or by the voice of my servants, it is the same. But that's wrenched from context, and the whole context says something a little different. What I, the Lord, have spoken, and I excuse not myself, and that isn't necessarily the same thing as saying whatever the Lord's servant speaks is what he says. There's a distinction there.
Right.
And D&C 1 actually is, one of the things I did to help myself on my mission was I read, the Book of Mormon 5 times and the D&C, I think, 5 times. And when you read it straight through very quickly, instead of extracting doctrine, what you get is the relationship between the Lord and his prophet. And you see this process of the Lord trying to help Joseph Smith grow. And you see the flaws and the folly, section 3 is Joseph Smith losing 116 pages. And it's full of rebukes and all the way through. And I think that's really interesting. But in D&C 1, verse 6, this is a formal statement of mine authority and the authority of my servants. So what is it that we should expect? And the expectations are set up right in verses 24 to 28. Behold, I am God, and have spoken it. These commandments are of me, and were given unto my servants in their weakness. It doesn't say in their perfection, in their weakness, after the manner of their language, that they might come to understanding, which means he's raising them up somehow. Inasmuch as they've erred, it might be made known. Inasmuch as they've sought wisdom, they might be instructed. That means they have to seek. We have to ask the question, seek and ye shall find, knock and it shall be open to you. It doesn't just say, blessed are they who sit like lumps, for they shall be spoon-fed. It talks about seeking. Inasmuch as they sin, they might be chastened, that they might repent. And the D&C and the Bible, in fact, is full of that stuff. Inasmuch as they were humble, they might be made strong and blessed from on high, and receive knowledge from time to time, which makes it not all the time. And it's also non-exclusive. Revelation is non-exclusive, because after saying, okay, I called Joseph Smith, and it says, verse 18, and I also gave commandments to others. That's unspecified who they are. Later on, he says, I, the Lord, am willing to make these things known unto all flesh. So we have an express declaration there that what we've got is imperfect, incomplete, and non-exclusive. And I noticed when I read Gerald and Sandra Tanner's book, I noticed that their whole life is based on the premise that the Mormons should be perfect, complete, and exclusive. So just based on that scripture, I can see that they wasted their lives. Because they're working under a false premise. And when you work under the false premise, then the wrong information becomes more significant. If you're saying, is he perfect? Then all that matters is imperfection. But it's like the kid looking at the dinosaur bones. I know the bones are real. And then I can read books, and find out all sorts of things about it. And then more can be learned, and we find out that some of what I learned was imperfect. But that doesn't change the fact that the bones are real. Awesome.
What was that scripture again? Doctrine and Covenants, what section?
Doctrine and Covenants, section 1. It's this formal declaration. As it says, this is a formal declaration of mine authority and the authority of my servants.
Awesome.
So I quote this all the time, on the boards, and then several times in my writing. So verse 6 says, this is mine authority and the authority of my servants. Verses 24 to 28 are the ones talking about, this is where their weakness, inasmuch as they've erred, it shall be made known. And as much as they sought wisdom, they might be instructed. And as much as they sinned, they might be chastened, that they might repent. And as much as they were humble, they might be made strong and blessed from on high, and receive knowledge from time to time. That sets up our expectations. And with those expectations, then I can deal with everything I see.
Right. The bar is, all of a sudden the bar is not this impossible thing set out of reach. It's now something that's within the realm of what our prophets carry out.
Right. And
perfect.
Yeah. And Thomas Kuhn's book, Structure of Scientific Revolutions, talks about how, in the sciences, anomaly only emerges against a background of expectation. That is, if a scientist is doing an experiment, he can't tell something's wrong unless he's expecting something different.
The other side of this, and I don't want to talk about this at length, but just to maybe mention it, because I know some people who listen to this will be frustrated by these same things. That's in the Doctrine and Covenants. I think there's plenty of examples of our leaders teaching that they should not be trusted in the sense that every single word that comes out of their mouth will be the mind and will of God. And yet, if you go into a ward on Sunday school and you try to talk about these kinds of ideas, I mean, you get angry stares, and sometimes you get people raising their hand and bitterly fighting against you in that because they've got this bar that's set way too high. I don't want to be long on this point, but any recommendations for how you help people to make assumptions that are more realistic?
Yeah. Well, one of the things that helps is, besides just learning about prophets and scriptures, I've also been interested in personality types. So I've got several books on the Myers-Briggs type indicator. And if you read, say, the descriptions of the ESTJ type, that's extroverted, sensing, thinking, judging, and there's certain patterns of behavior that show up. And when I read those books, I realized that a lot of what I'm dealing with is personality preferences. And there are 16 different personality types, and I can appreciate people for their differences. Also, some years ago, a lady named Vita Hill introduced me to something called the Perry Scheme of Cognitive and Ethical Growth. And here's position 2 of 9 on this thing. And it says, multiplicity pre-legitimate resisting snake. Now the person moves to accept that there is diversity. They still think there are true authorities who are right and the others are confused by complexities or are just frauds. They think they are with the true authorities and are right, while all others are wrong. They accept that their good authorities present problems so they can learn to reach right answers independently. Now, the Perry scheme was developed by a guy named William Perry, who was studying students coming into Yale from provincial little high school environments to a diverse university environment. And this is just a position of human development of dealing with complexity. And if I look at this and I realize, these people that want everything to be set up and have the true authorities with all the answers on the shelf, that's a stage of human development. That's a position. That's something that shows up in every society, every culture. It's just part of human development.
Right. Well, I get so frustrated when it's simply a recognition that there are others who are simply at the point where they're at, they're just not thinking along the same lines, and to cut them some slack for that. I struggle to death with that, as you well know, and it's hard for me, and I'm sure other people get frustrated with me over these same reasons, but you're right. We need to just take a step back and let people be where they're at, maybe plant a few seeds here and there, but not force people to transition from one stage to another within that scheme.
Yeah. And I found one of the ways that I've dealt with it all in all of the church environments I've been in is I realized that if I know the scriptures better than they do, and they're the ones that are saying, well, it's all in the scriptures and stuff, that they at least have to shut up and think.
Right. Right. No, absolutely.
They may not agree with me, but if I've got some scriptures that I can back myself up with, then they may give me a little bit more room.
Yeah, and I always do that. And obviously when first coming into my crisis and just coming out of it, I just wanted to blast people for these thoughts I was having that made their faith no longer fit for me. And what I've done lately is I'll throw a little seed out there. I'll back it up with a quote from a general authority or with a scripture. And then I'll let them know that there's some flexibility, that it's not just an all or nothing, that I'm right and they're wrong, but that there's an opportunity to maybe for all of us to think about it and to delve deeper into that subject.
Yeah. See, now you're turning into Alma in Alma 29, where he says, after having, wanting the voice of an angel to shake the earth and, hammer everybody into shape, he says, I sin in my wish. I ought not to arrow up my desires, the firm decree of God. I know that he granteth unto men according to their desire. He says it gives them to their wills. It's basically just saying in verse 8, the Lord grant unto all nations of their own nation and tongue to teach his word in yea and wisdom, all that he seeth that they should have. It's just this, Alma lets go.
Gotcha.
He doesn't let go of his testimony or his faith or his love, but he lets go of the idea of trying to compel anyone. And It turns into an invitation. And so I think there's that song that they sometimes sing, that does the first part and misses that I sin in my wish.
Right. No, and I think I'm still holding on with one hand, but I think this is crucial. I hope that listeners, when this episode is published, there will be a link to the document that Kevin is talking about, the Perry Scheme of Cognitive Development and Ethical Development, and it will be in the format that he's speaking of. There's the person you mentioned who has kind of condensed it into some ideas that we as Latter-day Saints can really work with. I'll share that with this episode so that everybody can read it. I'll also post your papers about the subject that we're talking about. I want to get into biblical test for assessing prophets. I want to kind of set aside for a moment the assumptions and expectations that we make. I want to talk about the actual realistic, scriptural, what I would call truthful assumptions and expectations that we should make. And the first thing that you list is claims that a prophet must make. What kind of claims should a prophet make using the scriptures?
They'll talk about revelation and vision. They'll have witnesses for what they've done. They'll talk about being chosen by God instead of, I choose God, they're rather called to be a prophet. And they are ordained by prophecy and the laying on of hands by those in authority. Those are fundamental claims according to these Bible scriptures.
And is there anything more than that, or is that essentially what we're left with? Those are the claims that a prophet must make.
And these are all very well documented in the scriptures. So when I look at Joseph Smith, so far so good. And I think you've raised the question about, well, what about the modern prophets? There's actually more of that going on than we pay attention to, I think. There's two aspects of it. There's Rick Smith had an article in the Recent Interpreter. He's responding to Denver Snuffer on this, and he actually has collected a surprisingly large number of accounts by modern prophets and apostles talking about revelations that they've received. And they're just not published and bandied about so much, but he's able to find a lot of it. And on the other hand, there was also a very good conference talk that I can remember, not where and when. I think it was Brother Packer. He talked about that the majority of the revelation that they receive is in terms of promptings and whisperings, rather than face to face or dictations. But those sort of things happen too, even if they're not published that often.
Right, and so like the scripture you used in D&C 1, when you talk about that, these big revelations shall come from time to time, and then understand that in between, that our leaders are generally just led by the whisperings of the Spirit, and to recognize that when that happens, when they're not the big revelations that are in your face, that there's going to be some room for them to maybe understand the inspiration, and I'll even go so far as to say incorrectly from time to time, or to say things in a way that maybe isn't the exact way the Lord would prefer it to have been done or to have been phrased.
Yeah, and that's all laid out in D&C 1 too. That sometimes we have to prepare ourselves to be able to ask the right questions so that we will understand the answer when it comes. There's also the passage in Ephesians about the prophets and apostles being called till we all come into the unity of the faith and not be tossed around to and fro by every wind of doctrine. It's an organization. It's going to have some. It's got a capacity to change, but it doesn't want to just bounce around like that. And one of the things that slows down the institutional church, I think that Quinn wrote about this, is that the D&C says that they have to have unanimity on everything. They all have to come to a oneness before they can change things. And that, for big policy changes, that often slows things down.
Right.
But that also made it so that there was an article on the blog this past summer talking about how when the priesthood revelation came in 1978, that I was in Salt Lake when that happened, and the response of the church was celebration and joy. It wasn't what the heck. It was, just I was going to where it was just before I got married, and I was over at my wife's apartment, and she just, I was coming up the stairs, and she looked down at me, and her eyes were big, and she says, "I just heard on the radio something, about this." And I went, and I'd seen a newspaper on the steps, and I went down and got it and looked up. There it was on the first page, and as I was reading, I heard car horns honking all over the city. So the experience there, there was no resistance to it. It was just yes. And this huge yes for us was remarkable to be there for.
Yeah. And I want to hit on this a little bit later when we talk about this unanimity, to have everybody be unanimous with the idea that all 15 men have to come to some agreement on something. I want to hit on that later as we talk about maybe why things don't fit, maybe some of those false assumptions. Number 2 you've got listed is teaching Christ. I think that one's pretty obvious, right? They teach about the Savior, they teach that He's the Redeemer of mankind, and they testify of Him.
Yeah, that He's come in the flesh, and that we're going to have prophets and apostles till we all come in unity of the faith. And there's an important one in there that accepts the biblical God. And that gets interesting because sometimes, like the evangelicals, actually Richard Baines was trying to do this, and we hammered him on that, is how is God understood in the Old Testament? And it turns out that what we get from Joseph Smith takes us back to the original understanding. But, that's one of the really cool things, but we've got the details in there.
Awesome. Like I said, this paper will be linked there. Number 3 you've got is character of teaching. Explain what you mean by that.
Well, what sort of things is he going to ask of you? And one of them is he's going to preach repentance, or is he going to say, eat, drink, and be merry, and just send money? He teaches one Lord, one faith, one baptism, one God and Father of all. That's just New Testament stuff. He teaches by the Spirit so that your faith stands in the power of God. As Nibley talks about this quite a bit in the World and the Prophets, is that they want you to believe in God, not in them. The open understanding of the Scriptures. That's something Brigham Young said about Joseph Smith. He said that he'd been to several different churches, but Joseph Smith could, reach up and take heaven and bring it down and lay it down so a child could understand it. Teaching consistent with Scriptures. And of course, since the Scriptures have inconsistencies, that leaves room, I think, for all sorts of wiggle room. Provides knowledge of the heavenly counsel. See, that's important. The proof text we always got on the mission was, Amos 3:7, surely the Lord God will do nothing, but He revealeth His secret unto His servants, the prophets. But the word that we translate as secret, sod, is a reference to the heavenly counsel. So the original genuine meaning of those scriptures that talk about that is that the prophet's business is to tell you about the heavenly counsel. And they teach their followers to expect trials in life. Oh, and also provides knowledge of God's covenant. The business of trials is important because like on my mission, I knocked on a door and this lady was upset because she said her husband was kind and good and faithful and he still died. It's sad, but the expectation, it's opposite that we get in the Book of Mormon where Nephi, in the first verse, he says, I've been highly favored of the Lord and I've also had many afflictions, which I think in that verse, it's taking you into a completely different world than that offered by Job's comforters, that this life is going to be hard.
Yeah, it often feels like we're told, and I get it, it's because, again, we go back to this Perry scheme of how we each think and reason things out, and we often, early on in our understanding, early on in our view, we grasp this idea that if we do the right things, we shall be blessed. And while that's true, we in our minds kind of determine what kind of blessings that should be. And so when negative things happen, we're really not prepared for it. We almost set ourselves up to view the world the way the scriptures talk about Abraham, which is when anything he did was good, and because everything he did was good, he was blessed with all these immense and great things, and his life was great, and he had an abundance of things, and he lived a long life. And yet, like you say, we've got Job, and even, to another extent, we've got the Savior who balanced that out. We've got Joseph Smith, who certainly does not fit this Abraham idea of having everything just because he's righteous. And so we've got to figure out some way to kind of even that out and not have that expectation be so high.
And now, a brief message from one of our sponsors. The sponsor is a regular listener to Mormon Discussion Podcast. He has written the book, 77 Days in September. It tells of a story of a man overcoming countless obstacles to reunite with his family after a terrorist attack disrupts the United States. 77 Days is based on a real threat, and while not LDS fiction, it is suitable for an LDS audience. It has sold over 75,000 copies, spent 5 weeks ranked in Amazon's top 100, narrowly missed the New York Times bestseller list, and has over 1,800 reviews with 90% of reviewers rating it 4 or 5 stars. If you like to read books, you will love 77 Days in September. 77 Days in September is currently available as an ebook for just $3.99 from Amazon.com, Barnes & Noble, iTunes, and Smashwords. Please show your support for this sponsor of our program by purchasing his book, 77 Days in September. And now back to the second half of our episode of Mormon Discussion.
So we've talked about the first 4. The last one you've got listed is evidences provided.
Oh, there's 2. There's also the personal character.
Oh, yeah, sorry, please.
He seeks to please God, not men. He teaches with authority and not as a scribe. They lead as willing ensamples to the flock, not for filthy lucre. They recognize and are united with authorized prophets. This was a big deal in New Testament times. And they admit to being men of passion like us, liable to sin. And the evidence is provided is that God bears them witness with signs and gifts of the Holy Ghost according to his own will. And the prophet may do works none other man did. There's an example in that they talk about John the Baptist, and they say John did no miracle. And there's several prophets that didn't do miracles. So you may get some impressive stuff in the case of Moses or, the Elijah stories. And we have Joseph Smith. I think the Book of Mormon is, there's nothing quite like it. Right. And, but it isn't necessarily going to be there, but if it shows up, pay attention. They teach that investigators must keep his words to learn the truth of them. That you're not going to be forced just by listening, that you've got to take some responsibility yourself. And prophecy, they teach that we must pray, and over time, arguments against a prophet fail and demonstrate confusion. So that's the 28 different tests from the Bible.
And so I want to follow this up with some questions. And the first one that kind of goes along with this list we just went through, in our mind, right, we have this word prophet. And to me, early on at least, and I'm kind of, I guess, working my way through this now, but in my mind, the word prophet means to prophesy. And yet, there are plenty of examples of modern day prophets who seem to go their entire time as a prophet and not prophesy. I guess my question is, must prophets give prophecies?
No. Well, and actually, some of the Old Testament scholars that I've been reading talk about this is they're not necessarily foretellers, but forthtellers. That is, they're not necessarily going to give a vision of the future, but they're going to talk about, how our behavior is going to affect our future. And I think that's important. I know Joseph Smith, I've got Crowther's book, Prophecies of Joseph Smith, where he's, got 100 or so prophecies that were fulfilled, and there's someone else that's done a longer thing. But then there's, they've also talked about, like Heber C. Kimball prophesied a lot, and he's hit or miss on those. I decided that in the Bible, that is the single most abused of the Bible tests, and it's the one most qualified by precept and example, and I give several examples of that. So, it's the best known test, and I think it's the best known test because it's the easiest one to manipulate the answers. Because if prophecies can be conditional, if it's going to take some time for it to be fulfilled, if it can be misinterpreted, if it can be misquoted, misreported, or whatever, there's all sorts of things that can go wrong with it. So I think the thing to do in that is to not over-rely on it. Plus, even the rabbis decided that they would restrict it to specific cases where they decided that it would only apply to short-term prophecy or consistency with long-term prophecies that have been already accepted. So they realized that there was some trouble in relying on that overmuch. But since I've got 27 other tests that are a lot easier to work, then I don't worry about that as much.
Gotcha. And so it's not a necessity that every prophet give prophecies, and then you also seem to be saying that even when they give prophecies, not that they should fail, but that it's not up to us to give the context in which necessarily those should come to pass, and that it may be more time required, or that our understanding of what the meaning of that prophecy is may be different from what the Lord intended.
Yeah, I mean, you've even got Jeremiah at one place. He's been prophesying the fall of Jerusalem, and he's become a figure of fun and mockery. And at one point, Jeremiah says, I think it's a remarkable passage. He says, to the Lord, wilt thou be unto me as waters, as a liar and as waters that fail. He says, but I couldn't stop speaking. I felt the spirit in my bones like a fire, and he had to continue. So even the prophet can be frustrated sometimes.
Right, that his words aren't being brought to pass so that he looks credible and looks like he's saying the right things. Awesome. I like that. So I want to follow that up. The number 4, when you talk about personal character, you talked about not teaching for filthy lucre. And one of the things I struggle with, and again, I always use these same phrases all the time because there's lots of things that as I've had to readapt my paradigm that I've had a hard time over. And one of them was we seem to be taught and teach and emphasize that we are a lay ministry and no one's paid. And then all of a sudden you wake up one day and you realize that the top leaders are paid. And while we don't know what they make, it seems like there's some indications that it's not millions of dollars, but it's also not $25,000 a year. And I don't want to get into what that is. I don't know if that even matters to the question. And I realize too that these men have given up their personal occupations and have dedicated their life full time to the church. That in that context, their families still need fed. They still need to be able to take care of their children. That there should be some pay there. I get that. But it comes across when you say, let's not teach for filthy lucre, and yet at the same time we emphasize tithing and our leaders are paid. How do we reconcile that?
Well, I think there's, the passages like you were just saying, they've got to be taken care of. There's one of the passages used in the New Testament is quoting the Psalms. It says, "Thou shalt not muzzle the ox that treads the corn." And they used that. Peter talks about it when he's talking about his living, and Paul talks about that he has the power to take the money, but he's just decided for himself that he's not going to do it. That he still does his work as a tent maker. So and I think there's a variety of how much any of these authorities need when they're called to it, but it is a sacrifice, and every one of them could be making a lot more money in the private sector without having to live in a fishbowl. So it's to accept a calling as a general authority is it's something that I wouldn't wish on anybody.
Right. Yeah. The rest of us get to retire at some point and take it easy, and yet these guys in their 70s and 80s are still flying around the country, getting less sleep probably than the rest of us, having discussions that impact millions of people. And you're right. I mean, these guys certainly, the brethren, are putting in a lot more effort, time, energy into something that the rest of us likely won't have to do at that point.
Yeah. And see, I've got some friends, who are ministers. And I look at the relationship that they have with their local congregation, where they have to, basically have their job performance review. And my bishop never has to go through anything like that. And I can see the difference, and I like these guys. They're my friends with their struggles and things. But it's, as the Latter-day Saint community, we're far less dependent on the paid ministry, even then. And the scriptures do give a pretty good idea of what it means to be preaching for filthy lucre. That there's, and to prophesying for money. That's, where, it's prophecy on demand sort of thing. If you pay enough, I'll give you a prophecy, that sort of thing.
It's dishing out the gospel at a price.
Yeah. It's a very, very different thing than consecrating your life to the service of the whole community. And it's very public. My sister actually is a CPA, and she, for a number of years worked, in the accounting department in the church office building and she's brilliant, so they gave her tough jobs, but she saw what was going on, and she had a very clear picture of it, and she saw the consecration involved. And, she heard a talk by, President Hinckley, where he'd had a written talk where he went down to the finance department once, and he instead of giving the talk, he just says, just treat it all like it's the widow's mite.
The last question, and we've already answered this, I just want to maybe ask it a different way and just maybe get your thoughts. My question is, what evidences do we have for President Monson being a prophet? And I'll share what it feels like to those who struggle, and even sometimes as I listen, I look at General Conference, and I always feel like the prophet takes the safest talk. That the things he talks about seem to be more gentle, more accepting, inclusive, and I think that even extends. I think President Uchtdorf and President Eyring have done a lot of that as well. And it seems like others within the Quorum of the 12 then pick up the slack of laying down the law and drawing the lines. And in that paradigm, in looking at it that way, I sit there and I look and I say, does President Monson give any prophecies? Does he give any revelations? Could 15 other intelligent, righteous men in that position lead with the same kinds of insights and changes that the 15 we have do? Your thoughts on that? And there may not be a perfect answer. Again, I think somewhere along the way, faith comes into the picture, and each of us have got to say, okay, these 15 men don't fail against these tests that you're laying out. And at some point, we have to lean on the Spirit to tell us whether these are men that are called of God or not. But how do you reconcile the idea that when you look at these men, at times, it doesn't feel like there's a lot of revelation or prophecy going on among the group?
Well, I think there is. I think it's just a matter of what nature, what questions they're asking, what their main issues are. And it's like in the Book of Mormon when Nephi has his vision. And he says, there's one point where he says that so much was Lehi's mind taken up with other things that he beheld not the filthiness of the water. Now that's the sense that each of these men is an individual and has his own individual concerns. And one of the things that's obvious about President Monson is his personal compassion, his one-on-one ministry. And, when he was called to be a bishop at, an amazingly young age, and then he, there's all of these widows in his ward, and he attends every funeral. It's,
right.
So I see that's his concern. And I think their ministry, the things that they specialize in, is going to grow out of their particular talents as individuals and what, the Lord wants at any particular time at that level. Now there's a guy named John Boyd who was a military theorist, and he came up with something called the ODA loop, the observation, orient, decision, action things. But then, this is something from the Wikipedia on his theory. He says that large organizations such as corporations, governments, and military, and of course a large church now, possess a hierarchy of loops at the tactical, grand tactical, and strategic levels. He stated that the most effective organizations have a highly decentralized chain of command that utilizes objective-driven orders or directive control rather than method-driven orders in order to harness the mental capacity and creative abilities of individual commanders at each level. What that's saying is, if a large organization is going to be effective, you're going to want to have general things being given in general conference and specific working out of details at the edge. And he calls this publication is called Power to the Edge, Command, Control in the Information Age. And he says, those kind of structures create a flexible organic whole that is quicker to adapt rapidly to changing situations. He noted, however, that any such highly centralized organization would necessitate a high degree of mutual trust and a common outlook that came from prior shared experience. Headquarters needs to know that the troops are perfectly capable of forming a good plan for taking a specific objective, and the troops need to know that headquarters does not direct them to achieve certain objectives without good reason. So I think I see that that the way that the church is organized, particularly now when we're really large, is the way that it should be. We shouldn't be getting all of the specific details about everything from them because then we'd just be sitting here waiting to be fed. We're all in situations where we have to take initiative and should take initiative and find our own inspiration and revelation, And I have to say, I've seen my wife receive direct revelation where I knew it. I knew what was happening and she knew what was happening. And it was for us exactly what we needed at the time. And it's very consistent with, the talk, where Elder Packer talked about. Most of the time it's those promptings of the Spirit. So if I've experienced revelation in my own personal life on occasion, not every day, not all the time, and not about everything, but at times when it's important. If you look through the Doctrine and Covenants for the guarantee on prophets, it's expedience. And that's it. But if what we get is what's expedient, that is enough.
I like that. I like the idea that what you're talking about is this concept of now more than ever, we probably need some flexibility with all the things that are out there on the internet, all the information that's available. Drawing lines in the sand is sometimes not helpful, and especially, let's just say it that way. And I understand what you're agreeing with too. We shouldn't draw lines in the sand that are unnecessary in the sense that they are not doctrinally backed up scripturally or by modern prophets, and that we ought to allow people to seek out the Spirit to make their own decisions. So, for instance, it would be incorrect to make conclusions of exactly how to live out the word of wisdom besides the 5 things we've been asked not to partake of, and that we each ought to go to our Father in heaven in prayer and seek out what His definition to us is, and we should live it. But we shouldn't force that definition on others. That we should allow everybody to receive their own inspiration on how they're going to live out that law, again, beyond the part that has been spelled out. Awesome. And I like to, we were talking a little bit earlier that while we may see prophets from time to time who seem to be, or at least are not sharing publicly, and so it's not apparent to us, they're not having these dramatic, revelatory experiences, that we ought to just understand that even through the scriptures, some prophets have these marvelous things happen, and other prophets, even as you pointed out, John the Baptist earlier, other prophets have very little that is miraculous occur to them. Absolutely. So we've got to have that flexibility. And so we ought not to hold every prophet to this idea that every prophet has to part the Red Sea. Yeah. Good. I want to hit on for a moment the obstacles that lead to rejecting biblical prophets. And you list two main ones, and you name them as fear and desire. And you define them maybe a little differently than what each of us, when we first hear the word fear or desire, what we mean by that. So would you mind explaining what you mean by fear and desire?
Well, our minds have, we've got our rational part, logical step by step, and we've got our emotional feeling part. And so our fear is what we think. It's our mental framework. It's the way we suppose things to be. Our desires are our ideals. It's how we want things to be. And there's this sense where it all ties up for me beautifully. There's when Jesus comes in 3rd Nephi, he says, I'm going to only ask for the sacrifice of a broken heart and a contrite spirit. The broken heart is, are you willing to give up things you want? And the contrite spirit, are you willing to learn? Are you willing to give up things you think to make progress? Because if we don't, we're going to be saying to God, I'm not going to give up what I want, and I'm not going to change what I think. And this turns out to be in the story of the Buddha. When he's under the Boo tree, he's meditating on the verge of enlightenment. He's tempted by Maya, who comes, represents the illusion of the world, and he's tempted with his fears and desires. And these are the things that always show up. So, my favorite example of distaste for a prophet's words, person or both, it comes from 1 Kings 22. And the king is asking about a prophet, and this guy says, well, there's one man, Micaiah, by whom we may inquire of the Lord, but I hate him, for he doth not prophesy good concerning me, but evil. There's this, also there's the famous story of the certain ruler who asked Jesus, what lack I yet? But he's very sorrowful on hearing the answer that called for him to give up something he desired. Now, in that case, it was his wealth, but it could be social position, it could be sexuality, it could be behavior, it could be political power. There's political stuff. If we let him alone, all men will believe on him, and the Romans shall come and take away both our place and our nation. And then there's complaints about unconventional behavior by the prophet. The Son of Man came eating and drinking, and they say, behold, a man gluttonous and a winebibber, a friend of publicans and sinners. Or they say, this man is not of God because he keepeth not the Sabbath day. Doesn't behave like I want him to. Or behavior by disciples. The disciples aren't behaving the way we want them to. Or it can be economic issues. And when our masters saw the hope of their gains were gone, they caught Paul and Silas saying, these men being Jews do exceedingly trouble our city. Or the story of the silversmiths who were opposed to Paul, where it's economic stuff. And the fear, where it's the thinking. When Jesus shows up in Nazareth, is this not the carpenter's son? Or why was not this ointment sold for 300 pence and given to the poor? They're putting up stuff like that. They're not measuring the profit. It's their idea of what they're getting. Or in misinformation in Matthew 28. Say ye his disciples came by night and stole him away while he slept. Misinterpretation. This fellow said, I am able to destroy the temple of God and build it in 3 days. Tradition or mental inertia. No man having drunk old wine straightway desireth the new, for he saith the old is better. Or, like another one from John. We know that God spake unto Moses, as for this fellow, we know not from whence he is. They charged blasphemy, which I think is really ironic, because thou being a man makest thyself God. We hear a lot of that ourselves. There's the God makers approach, which is using the same argument. Incredulity, and their words seemed to them as idle tales, and they believed them not. Or one of my favorites from John 6, after the Bread of Life sermon. This is an hard saying, who can hear it? Or the problem of appealing to authorities. Are ye also deceived? Have any of the rulers or of the Pharisees believed on him? So people use authority or consensus in some other way to circumvent examining what the prophet has offered. But in all of these cases, it boils down to it's not what I think or it's not what I want. And to enter into what's real, we always have to be able to at least risk that, to be able to say, well, okay, you may be asking me to sacrifice something that I want, but am I sacrificing it for something real? You may be asking me to change my thinking, but if I do change my thinking, will I get closer to understanding what is real? And that permits this opening up. It is the sacrifice of a broken heart and a contrite spirit that lets us come closer and closer to a knowledge of the truth and to behave ourselves in conformity with that truth, with the way things really are and the way things really will be.
That's great. There's when you talk about these two ideas of fear and desire, it kind of goes back for me to Ether 12:27, which is, we have our weaknesses, and those weaknesses can be the way in which we see the world, and it can be the way in which, I guess when we talk about desires, the things we want and the way we want life to work out. And yet prophets in their teachings almost never are going to fit those two things. And so we're going to have to submit ourselves. We're going to have to be humble. We're going to have to let go of what we expected everything to turn out as, or what expectations we felt had to be met. And we're going to have to kind of break things down and realize that things are perhaps not the way we framed them. And that goes back to that scripture that we see through a glass darkly.
Yeah, and it's a matter of just being willing to make the offering. And if we don't have to, to utterly surrender, but we just have to be able to ask the question, instead of saying, no, that can't be right. No, I'm not going to give this up. It's just be able to come up and at least be willing to make the offering by the inquiries that we make and by the behavior that we're willing to change.
Right. You, I want to kind of wrap up here with the last point, which is you finish with the idea of living with differences and uncertainty. And I want to maybe ask two questions. And one is, if we only have this small group of biblical tests, and I realize that there's a lot of points here, but what I mean by small group is that there are a lot of people outside the faith who in some ways might meet, or at least appear to meet, all of these as well. And so it almost kind of opens up a can of worms where we say, okay, lots of people can be prophets according to the test in which you've deciphered from the scriptures. How then do we cast out those who are not prophets? How do we make the decision between, yes, this person's a prophet because he fits all these biblical tests, and this person over here, he may fit these biblical tests as well, but certainly is not a prophet?
Well, I really don't think there's anyone who comes close when I look at the whole thing. But it's not a matter of saying all or nothing in terms of virtue, because when I talked about DNC1, it's telling us that what we have is expressly non-exclusive as far as revelation and virtue goes, and that we're imperfect and what we've got is incomplete, and that it's been a teaching from our prophets from the beginning too, that there's other truth out there and that there's virtue out there to appreciate and to embrace and sometimes to learn from.
Can I give you an example? So if we were to say some of these break-off groups from our church, and in some of these groups they have a prophet, and in many ways, I mean, he's giving talks that teach of Christ. He's fitting, and in my mind anyway, I look at these 5 biblical tests for assessing prophets, and it could be argued that this person fits all of these. How do we then recognize that that's a false prophet and that they're not called of God? I know that seems like a tough question, but
it's actually a New Testament question too. That they dealt with then, and that's where Paul is talking about. That if they went out from us, or actually at John, I think it's in 1 John or one of the little John epistles, is they went out from us, and because they went out from us, they're not of us anymore. There's that problem splitting off, and that's why the things on the succession of the priesthood, with Brigham Young and the succession of the church. I think the things that happened around that, where it's over 100 people reported, seeing him transform, which is, it's actually one of the best documented miracles in history as far as that goes. It's looking at the big picture, to look at all of the things, look at all of the works, look at everything that's going on, and also looking at ourselves. And if we're wanting to go off, into some sort of fringe group, are we doing it because it's real, or because in some way that it's where we don't have to sacrifice a broken heart and a contrite spirit? Right. And it's not about judging other people, because like you say, there are good people out there and people who are doing their best with what they've got. And my essay closes with Joseph Smith talking about that the people are going to be judged, not according to some absolute standard, but what they're able to do with the light that they had. But I think we're all accountable to try and improve on the light that we've got, rather than to just settle for what we're given.
And I want to follow that up kind of with the last question, which is, we talked about this earlier, right? That the 15 men have to be in agreement.
Yeah.
Unless there's some dramatic revelation, where the prophet says, hey, I've spoken to Christ and here's what's going on. These 15 men, when they're just feeling the promptings of the Spirit, have to be unanimous. And so the question comes up, which is, why does it seem like we're reactionary when things arise, or when a solution happens in the church? It almost comes after the fact of it being, how can I explain it? The race and priesthood announcement, the article that just came out, for instance, we have the church long past the time when we've corrected these racial attitudes in our culture. The church, for the first time in an article, admits that some leaders were influenced and made comments that were racist and wrong. Now, we've kind of flirted with it before. I think Elder Holland gave an interview in PBS where he said they probably would have been better off not saying anything than trying to give shape to the policy, but not really calling a spade and saying that was wrong. It was a racist point of view, and they never should have done that. Why is it we always seem to come after the fact of when something should happen? Addressing the needs on the internet. We have members who are leaving the church because they're struggling over historical issues, and it's been happening for a decade in a severe manner and getting worse and worse. And all of a sudden the church now is putting out articles online that address these issues and give people that explanation that now gives room for faith again. Why does it always feel like we're reactionary when in our mind the assumption is we're led by prophets and apostles, prophets, seers, and revelators, and we should always be a step ahead of the game, and that's not always the case? Do you mind speaking to that?
Well, yeah, because there's more complex games going on. And, well, there's a couple of things here that the church, for me, I don't think of the church as being an institution. The word itself means the assembly, the Greek, the ecclesia, it's the gathering, it's all the people. And so for me, once I got interested, this is after I got back from my mission, when I started taking initiative myself and learning things, I found I could get all the information that I wanted, about everything. I read, Taggart's little pamphlet, about the policy that generated, Lester Bush's article, which I read on Dialogue and stuff. So for me, that's the church. When I read that stuff in Dialogue and elsewhere, that's the church, every bit as much as what's happening in headquarters. But like this article that I read from, about John Boyd's idea about the power to the edge, I found the power on the edge. And that's just as much the church to me, that once I started asking questions and went to people who had the answers to the questions that I wanted, I felt like that I've been ahead of the game. And I understand that the nature of large institutions, like a large ship, it's going to take a long time to turn the thing. It's got a lot of momentum, a lot of inertia and things, but I don't have to wait for them, because I've noticed, there's been a lot of excitement about these things showing up on the LDS website. But this is stuff that I've known for 20 or 30 years or more. I can't get all that excited about it. When I got back from England and I started was interested in Nibley, and there was this down in our basement, there was a stack of improvement eras from previous years and ensigns, and I started going through those. They'd been coming into the house for years. There'd been the Nibley's article on Enoch. I hadn't even glanced at those. There was this 29-part series on the Book of Abraham. I hadn't glanced at those, so my feeling was this was here all the time, and I hadn't bothered to lift my eyes. And once I started doing that, then I just feel like I'm ahead of the game, and it's coming from members of the church. So to me, it is the church. And if it filters up through the institution, then really that's what I expect. And Todd Compton wrote an essay for Sunstone called Counter-Hierarchical Revelation about instances from, he took examples from just standard church history about where the impetus for revelation comes from the bottom rather than the top. And one of the examples is primary. There's a couple of sisters in Bountiful started doing primary, and the brethren heard about it, and then they made it a church policy. So this sort of thing, I think, is really what I should expect. And I think it's a good way for it to work. It's that the people that are further out and have fewer responsibilities really have a lot more freedom to move. And then if it turns out to be something good and it's proven itself and justified itself, then it can be distributed, as a whole. But I don't think it always has to come from the top. And there are things that have come from the top that we don't appreciate the quality of it because we're inside it. There was an article, done about youth in different churches in America, and this, the study was saying that the Mormons are really doing a better job of keeping their youth than other people. Well, so we're not in as much of a crisis because of these practices that we've had in place all the time. So we don't get excited about them. It's, oh yeah, we just take it for granted. But
right.
On the outside, other people that don't have that are saying, well, how come the Mormons are ahead of the game here? It doesn't, we're not always ahead of the game, but we can be. I'm involved, my job in the stake is I'm the addiction recovery rep, so I'm excited about 12 steps and what that does. Now that we didn't invent that, but it turns out Colleen Harrison has a book called He Did Deliver Me from Bondage. That's, a Book of Mormon 12-step book that shows that the 12 steps are in the Book of Mormon. So we had the solution, but we just hadn't asked the right questions or had the level of understanding to be able to see what we already had. So, I think in a lot of cases, we are ahead of the game and just don't know it yet because we haven't asked the right questions.
And that's good, because there is this assumption out there which is false, which is all revelation is top down. And it's not necessarily. There are lots of things that are bottom up, and we can find examples of that in the scriptures as well. When you talk about the gospel going to the Gentiles, and Peter's kind of the last guy to jump on board of that policy change.
Yeah, there's some good examples in the Old Testament about Moses. There's the story where Moses is trying to, everyone wants to come to Moses and get the answers, and Jethro, his father-in-law, says, "You're going to wear yourself out doing this. You've got to delegate." Okay, I'll delegate. Well, that's another thing. There's the story of some of the women are looking at the legal situation, are saying, "Hey, well, what happens to our inheritance if we don't get married?" Oh yeah, you're right. We didn't think of that. So then it was another bottom-up question. So this sort of thing, I think, just to recognize that it actually does go on, it gives us realistic expectations. Plus, it empowers us. Because, a few years ago when I wrote Paradigms Regained, and I was published through Farms, this is my study of Margaret Barker, the first one I did, I found out that the Dean of Religion gave copies of that to all the teachers at BYU. So here I am out on the fringes, and I'm just doing this thing, but it turns out to have a very large impact. So I'm one of these people that can have a much larger impact because the church exists, because something I come up with can go up to the top and then go back down again. So it's very empowering to me. I don't just have to wait. But also...
Right, and it makes us a lot more responsible for how we progress through our own spirituality. If we just sit back and simply wait for prophets and apostles to reveal everything, then we're just minions and robots, and that's not the idea. The idea is for each of us to be seeking and knocking and asking, and he who has eyes see and he who has ears can hear, and all of that we find within the scriptures that prompts us to be active in progressing within our faith.
Yeah, that's true.
Awesome. I want to kind of wrap up. I know that time is short, Kevin, so I want to kind of finish off with an idea. You mentioned Moses, and maybe this will kind of give us a last point just for you to share a thought on. You mentioned Moses, and one of the thoughts I always have with Moses is we compare modern prophets to prophets of old, and we talk about Moses and Noah. It's kind of how we began this podcast, with this comparison that we make and how sometimes this isn't realistic. And maybe to take it one step further, maybe it's more realistic than we think, in that we have the Israelites who follow Moses through the desert for 40 years. And Moses seems to be performing miracles, left and right. And yet the Israelites tend to kind of fall away. They're worshiping the golden calf. They're constantly murmuring almost as much as Laman and Lemuel. And it feels like Moses is doing all these great miracles, and these people are just so wicked, they're just not listening. But maybe perhaps if we just step away from the black and white idea, we recognize that these are stories that are written down, that there's probably a lot more going on than the condensed version that we get, and that perhaps even with Moses there are long stretches of time, months perhaps, because 40 years is a long time in the desert, perhaps months on end, where great miracles are not happening, where Moses says something or teaches something that doesn't quite feel right and maybe doesn't have the mind and will of God behind it. And when we start to see it in that way, it starts to make it then reasonable why these Israelites are constantly needing to have their faith enlarged, because they're constantly losing faith over the little things. And maybe if we can recognize that seeing now our modern leaders with these same kinds of weaknesses, and recognizing that some prophets have great and marvelous things happen, and maybe we go 1, 2, or 3 prophets without something spectacular happening. And as you pointed out, maybe even being more aware of the things that are going on that are spectacular, that we just discount as being kind of the standard because we're right in the midst of it. Maybe just your final thoughts on living with differences and uncertainty.
Well, I think it has to do with, if I'm expecting perfection, then I'm naturally going to gravitate towards imperfection as being the most important information. And I found a book years ago called Drawing on the Right Side of the Brain, where there's a diagram showing that, this is the quote that my essay starts out with, is that the things that we think are important or want to be important, we actually see as larger than they really are. And so this idea of trying to understand what's real and have realistic expectations, it helps us pay attention more to what really counts. And it always involves a broadening of the perspectives and being patient and being willing to remove the most from my own eye before I'm trying to judge other people. And so it's this movement towards acceptance, understanding, tolerance, which is all, I think, really what the Christian message is supposed to be, to look at these people and see, if I understand that they're doing their best, instead of saying, how come they're not, doing what I want them to do and trying to govern through tantrumocracy, isn't going to work. But, it's, I just see this work going on, and I have a very strong testimony of it. And, it's, the books are fun, but it all goes back to, for me, when I was, 18, just before my mission, and was reading the Book of Mormon and came across, Ether 12, where, Moroni says, and then shall you know that I have seen Jesus, and he spake with me face to face in plain humility as one man speaketh to another. When I read that, I felt like that event had happened, but that told me that God was someone who would speak to one of his servants face to face in plain humility. And to me, that's a God worth worshiping and worth making sacrifices to get to know.
Awesome. Kevin Christensen, thank you for being on today on the podcast. And I just appreciate it so much. You've given the listeners here a reading list of about 50 different things. There's a lot of growth I think each of us can go through if we maybe listen to this podcast again, this episode, and jot down all the things that Kevin has mentioned. There's lots of reading material to look into and lots of points that we need to understand, and to recognize that if we hold our prophets and apostles to the actual claims that the Bible sets out as test for them, that our leaders pass, and then taking that a step further, that each of us not only have a privilege but also the responsibility to seek out the Holy Spirit, that each of us can have a confirmation from that Spirit to know that these men are indeed called of God. Kevin, thank you so much.
Thanks, Bill. I appreciate it.